Welcome to a new episode of our webinar, the Life Science Acceleration Alliance is very happy to have with us today as a guest Neil Grubert. Neil is, in my eyes, the foremost expert on the Most Favored Nation policy, which is this major topic that we will talk about today. Neil, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? How did you become an expert on MFN?
Well, thank you. Very generous of you to call me an expert on MFN. I've been working in pharmaceutical access and policy for over 25 years now. Much of that time was with a company called Decision Resources Group based outside Boston, built up their market access business. And then for the last 11 years, I've been working as an independent consultant with a focus on global access and policy. So I really try to keep abreast of developments. I mean, Europe in particular, but also in North America and around the world, Asia Pacific and Latin America. And I think it's undeniable that the last year, MFN and other aspects of US policy have really been the dominant theme, not just in the US market, but around the world because of the repercussions that these policies are having. I really struggle to think of a precedent for that in all of the time that I've been tracking this field. It's really difficult to think of another example of a policy implemented by one country that will have such profound repercussions for healthcare systems around the world. But I think that's what we are seeing with MFN and tariffs and other aspects of US policy.
Well, MFN, Most Favored Nation policy, it's a beast of let's say an initiative. Let's call it very neutrally an initiative, and you can explain a little bit more. It has repercussions across the world, actually. It definitely impacts the EU. And I think if you, in your words, explain a little bit what it is that we're talking about, what is this thing, and how does it really impact trade as well as healthcare in different countries?
The most favored nation is really predicated on the premise that other affluent nations are not paying their fair share of the costs of drug development. As President Trump and others in his administration have said, they believe that Europe in particular, but also some other affluent nations, have been free riding on the United States for many years because of the substantial price differentials that we see for prescription drugs between the United States and Europe and other markets. So he really wants to put an end to that disparity, and that's why he formulated the MFN policy. So the idea is that it should achieve an equalization in the pharmaceutical market, whereby other affluent countries would pay a higher price for their prescription drugs, and that would allow the prices in the United States to be reduced, and so you would achieve this equalization that he is aspiring to. It's also worth saying that a further consideration is that this is intended to be broadly revenue neutral for the industry, so they shouldn't lose in terms of global revenue. And the rationale behind that is that that should then protect the resources that they have available to them to invest in future drug development.
So very, very sort of bluntly put is if everybody else pays more, they can pay less, and the industry has the same income.
Yes, that's it. I think a pretty good summary of the thinking behind the MFN policy.
But it does have side effects, and it's quite complicated. Plus, it is not even fully formulated. We hear every so often more details, further commentary and explanation from the US government, but it isn't really a completely done thing, and it isn't fully formulated in a sense, and it definitely isn't put into law, isn't it?
No, that's true. We have limited knowledge of the fundamentals of MFN. So 17 deals have been negotiated so far, and that's one of the other interesting characteristics of this. It is implemented by means of agreements negotiated with individual companies. So in May of last year, letters were sent to 17 big pharma companies inviting them to negotiate MFN deals. They were initially somewhat slow to respond, but then in September of last year, President Trump threatened to impose a 100% tariff on pharmaceutical imports if MFN deals were not signed. And that did seem to concentrate minds because in the weeks that followed, we had 14 companies of the 17 that had received letters announced that they had reached agreement in principle on MFN deals. A further two followed in January, and then the last within the last few weeks. So now all 17 companies that received letters inviting them to negotiate MFN deals have done so. What we can gather from the statements that most of those companies issued after signing agreements in principle, and from fact sheets issued by the White House, is that there are four core elements to MFN deals. So the first is that companies should offer MFN prices to state Medicaid programs, and Medicaid is the program that covers people on low incomes in the United States and is administered at state level. So states should have the opportunity to benefit from MFN prices. I think the really significant new development is a requirement for companies to commit to offer MFN prices on all their future drug launches in all sectors of the US market. So Medicaid, Medicare, the program that covers primarily people age 65 and older, and most significantly, the commercial sector. So that is, I think, something of a departure because historically the US government has tended not to intervene in pricing in the commercial sector, which is the most important sector of the US market. In addition, companies have committed to offer at least some of their drugs through direct-to-consumer distribution, and they seem to be signing up to a new initiative from the White House called Trump RX, which provides links to companies' own direct-to-consumer websites. So if a patient wants to check if their drug is available direct-to-consumer, they can visit Trump RX, which will then direct them to company-specific platforms if that drug is covered under direct-to-consumer distribution. And that is really intended to combat the influence of the pharmacy benefit management companies that play a very important role in the US pharmaceutical system at present. And then the fourth key element of these agreements is a commitment to repatriate to the United States any additional revenue that may be realized in other countries from higher prices and sales, and that will help to support the price cuts in the United States that are really the key aim of MFN. One further feature I think that we should mention is that companies are generally expected to commit to increase their investment in drug development and production in the United States, specifically to meet the needs of the US market from domestic production. So we've had announcements totaling several hundreds of billions of dollars by some calculations, in excess of $500 billion in terms of investment projects in drug development and production in the United States. I think there are some questions about how much of that money is new. I think some of those projects were probably already planned prior to the announcement of the MFN policy, but clearly there is a push to increase investment in the United States, and that may have implications for the industry elsewhere in the world, in particular in Europe. If it will become more difficult to export drugs produced in Europe or other countries to the United States.
The United States has a very different system. It's a multi-tier system, and you mentioned that before. There are intermediaries in there, so the whole pricing mechanism is very different from other parts of the world, definitely from the EU typically. MFN is not really designed to fix these problems. It's going a different route. Trump government probably is happy as long as the financial numbers are achieved, and also A lot of the nice announcements are there that are seen as value in itself. The question is how much spending will actually happen, and the lead time with big investments. We know all that it takes years, so we'll see how that materializes. But at the moment, the momentum is on his side. The challenge is that from what we see, the EU doesn't really have a clear answer, and to some degree, even not a clear understanding of what MFN means and what kind of impact it has. When we look at Germany specifically, we just had this wonderful new law that was tabled, and I have to read it because it's such a wonderful Statutory Health Insurance Contribution Rate Stabilization Act. Isn't that great? So this law is again similar to the ones in the past, focused on driving down prices, on clawing back from the industry, of getting rebates. So since, and we haven't mentioned that, maybe we should talk about that afterwards, there's a basket of countries that are relevant for the pricing, for establishing the price in the US. So Germany has an impact there, and the way that this law is formulated, it does not take into consideration the side effects or the impact of MFN. We see similar things done in other member states. Sweden, for example, is monitoring very closely what the impact might be. We know that Switzerland has moved ahead already and was banking on confidentiality of the prices. Now, MFN clearly torpedoes that because the confidentiality is to the public, but the companies are required to disclose the prices, even though they are confidential. So they are kind of breaking through that shield in a sense. What is your interpretation? How would you describe the situation as it is?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that Germany in particular is a key player in terms of MFN. So the core policy uses a basket of 8 comparator countries. So they are the G7 markets, excluding, of course, the United States. It's not using itself as a comparator. So they are the 4 big economies in Europe: Germany, France, the UK, and Italy. Plus the other members of the G7, Japan and Canada, and then 2 more for good measure, smaller economies, but significant players in the global pharmaceutical industry, namely Switzerland and Denmark, home, of course, to major pharmaceutical companies. So prices in those countries will be used to calculate the most favored nation price. That will actually be the second lowest price in the comparator basket, to exclude any outliers at the bottom end of the range. And it will be a purchasing power parity adjusted pricing. So to take account of differentials in terms of purchasing power parity adjusted GDP per capita among these countries. So they are really the core countries. They will be the direct comparators used to calculate MFN prices. I think there is some concern that the repercussions could extend beyond those, not least because of the established practice of international reference pricing across much of Europe. So countries reference others, and therefore their prices could be drawn in directly. So I think there are significant implications probably for most of Europe. There are also proposals for 2 what are called demonstration projects called Globe and Guard, which would relate to Medicare, as I said, the program for older people, 65 and older. And they would have a significantly larger basket of comparator countries, so 19 in total, and most of those 19 are in Europe. So that potentially could have implications for the wider market in Europe and beyond. I should also say that it appears that companies that have struck MFN deals, in particular, that have signed up for this demonstration project called Generous, relating to Medicaid, by doing so, appear to gain exemption from these other demonstration projects of the wider basket of comparator countries. But I think what we are seeing is a hesitancy in certainly in the core markets, and indeed in the wider list of 19 countries and beyond that, in terms of the implications of pricing in those markets for the US price. And as a result, there seems to be a growing hesitancy on the part of the industry to launch in those markets at present. To come back to your question about how Germany and other countries are responding, it is interesting. I mean, if we take Germany initially, they have been conducting a pharma dialogue for some time now, and I think the industry was optimistic that could address some of the challenges presented by MFN. Reports indicate that was on the agenda, but also that it was given less attention than cost containment, and that would appear consistent with the measures that have been proposed in the Statutory Health Insurance Contribution Rate Stabilisation Act. That name is in keeping with the long tradition of names for such bills in Germany. So the focus does seem to have shifted towards cost containment. In particular, introducing a dynamic element to the manufacturer rebate, which is a real cause for concern to the industry, and introducing rebates of therapeutically comparable drugs. So that would seem not to be in keeping with the need to respond to MFN. Sorry, you wanted to come in.
What we should make clear is that MFN is focused on innovative new drugs. It is not really dealing with the drugs in the system and the prices that have been negotiated prior. The side effect of that is, though, that the new drugs may come later to individual countries, may come later to the European Union, because the price impact in the US, which is the largest market for pharmaceuticals, for industry, is not to be, how should I say that, estimated, not known at this point in time. It may have a massive impact. There's a lot of uncertainty around it, which, by the way, also is, of course, something that investors hate. So, on the one hand, we have much less drugs that are in the focus of this policy, but we also have an impact across the board. Is that correct?
So I think what's captured attention is the impact on future launches. It should be said that the established market can be impacted to some extent through Medicaid. Prices in the comparator countries could feed back and have implications in the Medicaid market, or indeed potentially even in this direct distribution. So we have had an example in Denmark in the last month or two of a drug that was withdrawn from the Danish market, and the company cited international pricing considerations. So it didn't explicitly name MFN, but mentioned international pricing considerations. The drug was not withdrawn in other neighboring markets, but a few weeks later, it was listed on Trump RX. So I think there's been a widespread assumption that there's a correlation between withdrawal of the drug in a comparator market and its addition to the Trump RX platform. So I wouldn't suggest that established drugs are completely immune from the effects of MFN, but it's certainly true that future launches have been the focus of attention as much as anything, because this is a novelty, I would say, and companies are having to give considerable thought to the implications of the price that they could achieve in European markets for their price in the United States, given that in the vast majority of cases, the global first launch market will be the United States. So they'll launch there, and obviously won't know what price they're likely to achieve in Europe. And particularly now, while there's still so much uncertainty about just how MFN will play out, the evidence suggests that companies are holding back from launching in Europe. So we don't have really robust hard data to confirm that at present. But we're hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I'm hearing that from my conversations with individual companies. A number of industry associations are reporting that in Europe and elsewhere. I think it's also interesting that the drugs entering the EU Joint Clinical Assessment system are substantially down on the forecasts that we had from the HTA coordination group, both for last year, which was the first year in which that initiative was implemented, and for the first third of this year. They're way below the figures that they cited. Now, those are only estimates, but it certainly appears that marketing authorization applications are down on what we might expect. And I just recently heard of a company that had suspended its plans for to prepare for a joint clinical assessment because for the time being it's holding back from launch plans in Europe. That may change as we get more clarity and certainty on MFN. Companies may then be more willing to undertake a launch in Europe, but for the time being, there's a real hesitancy, I would say.
Yeah, as you know, we are looking at things from an investor's perspective. The Life Science Acceleration Alliance is focused on early stage life science companies, innovation drivers when it comes to healthcare. And the MFN, of course, is focused on impacting prices at the time when new drugs reach the patients or the system is deciding on how to pay for that. But uncertainty is something that definitely impacts investment decisions, and there's hesitation that is noticeable within the investment community. And we do have a challenge of getting enough venture capital funds into the EU to really develop these companies and hopefully bring new drugs to market. And that is, in a sense, one of the challenges and questions that we are struggling with. How do you see that? What is it that member states, that countries could do to protect the one and at the same time deal with the challenges of MFN?
So I think the historical certainties that we've had around the launch of new drugs can no longer be taken for granted. So as a general rule, companies would launch first in the United States. That is a generalization. Obviously, there are instances where Europe would be the first launch, global first launch market, or Japan or China for that matter. But overall, I think the evidence is clear that the United States is overwhelming the first launch market of choice, and then typically a launch in Europe would follow 2 or 3 years later. Sometimes the interval is shorter than that. But the expectation would be that a launch in Europe would follow. At present, we cannot assume that, I would say. So there shouldn't be much, if any, impact on launch plans in the United States, because that's the market remains the prime target for the industry, and that's the market that's intended to benefit from the MFN policy. But the hesitancy that we are seeing in Europe means that we can no longer take it for granted that there will be a reasonably timely launch in Europe. Indeed, as things stand, it may be that drugs are not launched in Europe at all, or at least in some markets in Europe. And I think we've had a recent example of that with Insmed. In its most recent earnings call for Q1, it discussed the implications of MFN. So it's recently gained approval for a new drug in the United States last year, but more recently in Europe and Japan. But as announced for the time being, it doesn't intend to to pursue launch plans in Europe and Japan because of the uncertainty around MFN and the impact that that would have on pricing in the United States. They're very keen to go ahead and launch, and that's not surprising. That would be true of any company, but particularly a company of its size, which has just now its second drug in its portfolio. It would obviously be highly motivated in normal circumstances to launch in every market in which it has regulatory approval. But it feels, speaking very candidly, that it cannot take that risk at present. Hopes that there'll be greater clarity around MFN in the coming weeks and months, and that will enable it to go ahead with its launch plans. But I think that's perhaps an illustrative example of the challenge that companies are facing, in particular smaller companies. So I think governments in Europe really have to give that serious thought. The impact that this will have initially in terms of drug development activity and clinical trial activity, which is important in terms of a route to early access to promising new medicines for patients, but also the contribution that makes to economies in Europe. So they risk losing out on that. But then in the longer term, on access to those medicines and the benefits that they will bring to patients, and in still longer term, if we see these drugs are not being launched in Europe, then that may make it more difficult down the line to conduct clinical trials, because the standard of care in Europe will be increasingly outdated compared with the United States and perhaps some other markets around the world. So I think there are all of those considerations. Governments are not surprisingly very focused on issues around cost containment, not least because of the competing demands on budgets, and especially at present, and the coming months could just intensify those pressures. But they also need to take a longer term perspective and think about what they stand to lose if we do see an exodus of investment from Europe. And then there are also considerations around security of supply and strategic autonomy, which I think have come into sharper focus in recent months and years, and will remain very pertinent, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think there are forces that are pulling in different directions. It's on the one hand, of course, patient needs, and no politician wants to have patients that are not treated appropriately, that don't have access to the newest medication, especially if it's life-saving. You have the wish of autonomy, as you said, that there's an independent supply chain and a reliable one for Europe. It's also the industry, building an industry, developing the wonderful science and research that's available and still developed in the EU into companies that have a global presence, or at least a substantial economic presence. Those are all things that are seen as desirable. They are also expressed goals of the politicians, of the governments. But bringing everything together and finding the right balance seems to be the very big challenge at the moment. I haven't heard anybody who says, I have the silver bullet. I don't know if you have one. If you do, please share. But our crystal ball is a little cloudy. So, what would your recommendation be? Or is there right now just a wait and see, watch closely approach that works?
Yeah, I wish I had a silver bullet. If I did, I would probably be lying on a sun lounger somewhere in the Caribbean now. Yeah, it is difficult to know, not least because of the uncertainty that we see, and I think that's likely to persist. We may never get complete resolution to that, even though President Trump has said that he wants Congress to codify MFN. And the Democrats in Congress have said, well, if we're to do that, then we need to understand what it involves much more clearly. How can we codify it otherwise? But there doesn't seem to be a willingness to disclose that. There's been real focus on maintaining the confidentiality around the detailed terms of these agreements. I'm even hearing that from within companies that have signed these deals. The information on the terms of the deals is being shared on a need-to-know basis, and that is being defined and enforced very strictly indeed. So even people that you might assume would have access to information on that don't. They're really gaining their information from what's in the public domain, along with the rest of us. I would say. I think the EU and national governments do need to try to take as broad a perspective as possible. So clearly, they do need to think about cost containment. That's we have to be realistic. That will remain an imperative, and in some ways, that is only going to increase. But just as governments have had to confront realities around levels of expenditure and investment in defense, they may have to do that in terms of spending on medicines. I think we're starting to see some recognition of that at the other end of the innovation spectrum. So there's a recognition that they may have to accept somewhat higher prices and different approaches to tendering for generics and biosimilars. So rather than going just for lowest price, which is a trend that has driven production out of Europe to other markets and has left Europe very exposed in terms of its security of supply chains, that to attract that investment back, you may have to accept higher prices and sort of most economically advantageous tender terms. Perhaps there's less recognition of that. Curiously, at the more innovative end of the spectrum, but seeing the contribution that makes and the importance of maintaining strategic autonomy and security of supply. I think a trend that I am starting to pick up on is that some countries seem to be increasingly willing to entertain the possibility of significantly higher prices for drugs that they consider to be real innovations, so breakthrough drugs. So perhaps want to explore ways to reward those, but at the same time would perhaps take a much stricter attitude towards drugs that are not deemed to be innovative, so to offer little or no advantage over established therapies. So at this stage, I think we're really hearing that perhaps quite sort of speculatively from policymakers. We're not hearing HTA agencies saying that they are directly planning to change their methods. But I think it's an interesting thought. I saw comments from the head of the Dutch HTA agency recently saying, well, we're really not concerned about having access to 100% of new drugs. We're interested in getting access to the really promising ones that will make a difference. And I think we've heard some similar comments from Spain and Italy, in particular, sort of senior figures in ministries of health in those countries. So that may be a direction of travel going forwards. The difficulty, of course, for companies is, particularly in the early stages of development, is to know whether this drug in development is going to fit that bill, be a breakthrough.
And it's also something that is, in a sense, open to debate. I mean, we have already a classification system that sorts out the ones where there's no additional benefit. And the disagreement about is that correct or not is there and has been there for a while. So It would just emphasize that. And the uncertainty in when you start developing something, if it falls into bucket A or bucket B, is of course very real. And again, it comes back to investment decisions. Which company are you backing? When you look at the corona pandemic, who backed BioNTech was the winner and CureVac was the loser at the time. It was basically impossible to establish who would be in which
Yes,
bucket. So it
yes,
is a real challenge. And what I'm hearing, and that would be sort of kind of wrapping it up, we need to continue to monitor. We need to continue to see how things are developing because it's still a moving target. Policymakers need to consider all kinds of aspects in their decision-making process, proposing new laws. Focusing just on one area and not really looking beyond isn't really going to get the result that you want. And the other thing is, of course, that there are long-term implications of decisions that are made today because, again, we talked about new drugs, things that are coming down the pipeline. If they are not coming anymore, and you won't know that until they're really market ready in a sense, you won't really know what the damage is or what the danger is to your patients or your population. So it is a difficult period because many questions are open, not answered. And again, coming back to our community, investors are really have to live with a lot of uncertainty at the moment. I don't really know that there's in healthcare and life sciences an area where you can say there everything is clear, everything is fine. When you look at innovation, when you look at investments in new medications and new treatments and so on, I think there's always a certain degree of uncertainty, but that has just gotten a lot larger.
absolutely, absolutely. And I would say it's also really important to take a medium to long term perspective. So the MFN deals are really 3 year agreements in the first instance, and I do sometimes get a sense that companies sort of signed up to them on that understanding. The the Trump administration is now pressing for those to be codified, and one of the main reasons for that is to extend their longevity beyond 3 years so that they will remain in place beyond the end of this presidency. Now, Congress so far has shown little enthusiasm for taking up that challenge and codifying the MFN agreements. As I said, the Democrats have said, well, if you're asking us to do that, we need more clarity on the terms of those agreements. But the industry also has shown little enthusiasm for that. Perhaps the hope is that we can ride out these three years, and that will come to an end, and then we can go ahead as usual and launch in Europe. I'd be surprised if there's really a way back from some of these measures. I think the precedent has been set, and we also need to consider the possibility that there could be a significant shift in power in Washington, D.C. in the next 3 years. And experience would suggest that the Democrats might run with what's there and take it to another level, and in particular might look to introduce measures that would more directly regulate the price in the United States, rather than just say it mustn't be higher than in Europe or elsewhere, leaving companies that free hand to set prices. So that really would be a game changer if we were to see something like that reach the statute books, and then that might also have really significant implications for the US market. So even now, I would say the industry needs to think carefully about the migration to the United States and becoming over reliant on the US market, because in due course it might feel a need to sort of turn back to Europe, and so needs to maintain a reasonable balance and not burn bridges at present. I think what will also be interesting in that time frame, sort of 3, 5, even 10 years, is to see what will happen in terms of the contribution that the Chinese industry makes in globally. So it's been growing at an incredible rate. Strides it's been making recently in 2024 overtook the United States in terms of the number of new drugs that were approved for the first time, coming from almost nowhere just 4 or 5 years earlier. I've seen data that suggests that 44% of new molecular entities that entered development in 2025 originated in China. So, what role will it play globally and in Europe in particular? Will it be a risk, a threat, an opportunity? I suggest it will be a combination of the three. A threat to established multinationals, and unless, of course, they find ways to engage, to license in or co-develop, in which case we see the opportunity there. But there's also potentially the risk of becoming over-reliant on Chinese developed drugs. So policymakers at EU level and national level are going to have to give serious thought to that. And it will also be interesting to see how that compares with the United States, which I think has shown itself to be much more skeptical and suspicious of the sort of rise of the Chinese industry and the competitive threat that it poses to US hegemony in the life sciences.
Well, thank you very much for your insights, for your time, for your wise words, and we'll continue to watch the space and may invite you again and see what we all have learned. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Rainer.